At 7:23 in the morning, on April 9, 1945, Sergeant Mike Collins stood atop his Sherman tank on the outskirts of Berlin, staring at the massive German Panther tank they'd just destroyed. The Panther's armor had been pierced cleanly through the side, its once fearsome silhouette now a smoking wreck blocking a narrow German street. A year earlier, that same Panther would have obliterated Collins's Sherman before he could even bring his gun to bear. But Collins hadn't engaged it head-on. He'd used tactics that no German tanker in 1941 could have imagined American crews would master. "Told you boys we'd get him," Collins said to his crew, his voice crackling through the intercom. "Flanked him just like the manual says." The Sherman, nicknamed Detroit Diesel by its crew, had survived 3 major campaigns and 14 direct engagements with German armor. Its original olive drab paint was scratched and scorched, but it was still running, still fighting, still killing German tanks that were supposedly superior in every way. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Sherman tank had once been mocked by German tank commanders. When the M4 Sherman first appeared on North African battlefields in late 1942, German tankers had called it a Ronson lighter, a dark joke implying it would light first every time when hit. German propaganda had boasted that their Panthers and Tigers were invincible against such inferior American engineering. The Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor from any practical combat distance. Its own armor was too thin to withstand the mighty 88mm guns of German heavy tanks. On paper, the Sherman was outclassed in almost every technical specification. Yet somehow, by April 1945, thousands of these supposedly inferior tanks were converging on Berlin, while the vaunted German panzers were burning wrecks scattered across Europe. The Sherman had not just survived the war, it had become one of the most decisive weapons of World War II. How did a tank that was outgunned, under-armored, and technically inferior on nearly every specification help win the greatest conflict in human history? The story begins not in a tank factory, but in the mind of an industrial logistics expert named William Knudsen. In 1940, as Europe fell to Nazi Germany, President Roosevelt appointed Knudsen to lead American industrial mobilization. Knudsen wasn't a military man. He was a former president of General Motors who understood mass production better than almost anyone alive. When Army Ordnance officers approached him with competing tank designs, Knudsen didn't immediately ask which had the biggest gun or the thickest armor. He asked, "Which one can we build 10,000 of before Christmas?" The answer was the Sherman. Designed to be manufactured using existing American automotive industry tooling and techniques, the M4 Sherman could be produced at a rate that no other nation could match. While German factories struggled to produce 200 Tigers in a year, American factories could build 200 Shermans in a week. Detroit automobile plants were converted to tank production almost overnight. Factories that had been making tractors, locomotives, and cars were retooled to produce Shermans. The Sherman was not designed to be the best tank, it was designed to be a good tank that could be built in overwhelming numbers. As Major General Leslie McNair, the Chief of Army Ground Forces, put it, "The Sherman tank has been widely criticized as inferior to German tanks, especially the Panther and Tiger. Actually, it was deliberately designed to be a mass-production weapon rather than the best possible fighting vehicle." This philosophy ran counter to German tank design, which prioritized technical superiority over production efficiency. The German Tiger cost more than twice as much to produce as a Sherman, and required significantly more man-hours to build. It was an engineering marvel that could dominate any battlefield, if it could reach the battlefield at all. Tigers frequently broke down due to their complex mechanical systems and overweight design. They consumed enormous amounts of increasingly scarce German fuel. Their production consumed rare materials that Germany simply could not supply in adequate quantities. Lieutenant Paul Frey, an American tank commander who fought in the Ardennes, later described the difference. "The Germans built each tank like it was a custom Rolls-Royce. We built ours like Ford Model Ts. Guess which approach won the war?" The Sherman was reliable in ways that German tanks never were. It could run for hundreds of miles without major mechanical failures. Its parts were standardized and interchangeable. A. Sherman damaged in battle could often be repaired and returned to service within hours, using parts salvaged from other Shermans. But reliability alone wasn't enough to overcome the Sherman's disadvantages in one-on-one combat. The 75mm gun on early Shermans struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers. In the bocage country of Normandy after D-Day, American tank losses were sometimes severe. Sherman crews developed a gallows humor about their predicament. They joked that the 5-man crew was 4 dead men and a driver. While individual German tanks were indeed more powerful, the Sherman had advantages that weren't immediately obvious on the battlefield. For one, the Sherman was amazingly adaptable. Its basic chassis could be modified for dozens of different roles: flamethrowers, mine clearers, bridge layers, recovery vehicles, and assault guns. German tanks were specialized and difficult to modify. The Sherman's adaptability meant that Allied forces always had the right tool for the job, even when that job changed rapidly. Moreover, the Sherman's mechanical reliability meant it was almost always where it needed to be, when it needed to be there. German Tiger commander Otto Carius once wrote that a tank that cannot move is not a weapon, it's a pillbox waiting to be destroyed. German Panthers and Tigers spent so much time being repaired or waiting for fuel that they were often absent from critical engagements. American tankers joked that the best German tank is the one that runs out of gas before it sees you. But the most important advantage of the Sherman was tactical, rather than technical. American commanders recognized early on that tank versus tank combat was not the primary mission of the Sherman. Tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs and support infantry. When forced to engage enemy tanks, Shermans would do so, using tactics that minimized their disadvantages and maximized their strengths. Colonel Creighton Abrams, who would later become Army Chief of Staff, pioneered many of these tactics in late 1944. Abrams understood that Shermans could not win frontal engagements with Panthers and Tigers. Instead, he taught his tank commanders to fight in coordinated groups, use terrain for concealment, strike from the flank, and rely on superior mobility to avoid being fixed in place. "Never fight the battle the enemy wants to fight," Abrams told his officers. "Make him fight the battle you've prepared for." This approach was exemplified during the Battle of Aracourt in September 1944. German panzer units equipped with Panther tanks attacked American Sherman units of the 4th Armored Division in what should have been a decisive German victory. On paper, the Panthers outclassed the Shermans in almost every respect, but American tank commanders used the early morning fog for concealment, positioned their tanks in hull-down positions behind ridgelines, and engaged the Panthers from the flank rather than head-on. The result was shocking even to American commanders. The Shermans destroyed 69 Panthers while losing just 16 of their own. German tank crews, trained to expect American tanks to flee or be destroyed, were unprepared for the sophisticated tactics used against them. As one captured German panzer officer remarked afterward, "We were told American tankers were cowboys who could not fight. What we found were cowboys who could fight very well." The U.S. Army also developed a comprehensive training program for Sherman crews. While German tank training deteriorated as the war progressed due to fuel shortages and the desperate need for new crews, American training improved constantly. By 1944, American tank crews received extensive training in gunnery, maintenance, tactical movement, and crew coordination. They practiced against mock-up versions of German tanks to learn their weak points. They trained in all weather conditions and terrains. Technical improvements eventually caught up with tactical innovations. By mid-1944, many Shermans were receiving the more powerful 76mm gun that could penetrate Panther armor at combat ranges. The Easy 8 variant added wider tracks for better mobility and a more powerful engine. British modifications like the Sherman Firefly mounted the powerful 17-pounder gun that could destroy any German tank at standard combat ranges. Still, German propaganda continued to mock the Sherman. As late as January 1945, German newsreels showed footage of burning Shermans and claimed that American tanks were rolling coffins that couldn't stand up to superior German engineering. But the reality on the ground told a different story. While individual German tanks remained formidable, They were becoming increasingly rare. Germany simply could not replace its losses at the rate that America could produce new Shermans. By the time Sergeant Collins and his Sherman crew entered Germany in March 1945, the balance had shifted decisively. American tankers had learned how to fight and win against supposedly superior German tanks. They had mastered the tactics of flanking, coordinated fire, and combined arms operations. They had learned to use their mobility and numbers to overwhelm German defences. And perhaps most importantly, there were simply so many of them. The numbers tell the story. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks in dozens of variations. Germany produced approximately 1,400 Panthers and just 1,347 Tigers of all types during the entire war. As Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov supposedly remarked when told of the technical superiority of German tanks, "Quantity has a quality all its own." Major General Maurice Rose, commanding the 3rd Armoured Division, put it more directly to his tank commanders before entering Germany. "They may have better tanks, but we have more of them, and our tankers are better. Never forget that." Rose's division would go on to destroy more German tanks than any other American unit, proving his point in the most direct way possible. The Sherman's true impact became clear during the massive Allied offensive in the spring of 1945. As American armies pushed into Germany from the west and Soviet forces drove in from the east, the remaining German armoured units were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Allied tanks. For every Panther or Tiger that managed to reach the front lines, there were dozens of Shermans. German tank factories were bombed into rubble, while American production continued unabated. For German civilians watching endless columns of Shermans roll through their towns, the psychological impact was devastating. As one German civilian from Cologne later recalled, "We had been told for years that American equipment was inferior. Then we saw thousands of their tanks, all identical, all well-maintained, all advancing without stopping. It was then I knew Germany had lost the war completely." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By April 1945, as Collins and his Sherman crew fought through the outskirts of Berlin, the once-mocked American tank had become a symbol of Allied industrial might. German generals who had once dismissed the Sherman as technically inferior now watched helplessly as thousands of them converged on the Reich capital. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, when interviewed after the war, admitted, "We could have handled the Sherman one against one, but they never came one at a time. They came in thousands." The final irony of the Sherman story came in the last days of the European war. As Berlin fell and Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, thousands of Shermans were already being prepared for shipment to the Pacific for the planned invasion of Japan. The tank that German propaganda had mocked as inadequate had outlasted the Third Reich. Production continued even as the war in Europe ended, with newer models incorporating lessons learned from every campaign. For tankers like Sergeant Collins, the technical debates about armour thickness and gun penetration values were academic. What mattered was survival and victory. His Sherman had brought him from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of the Third Reich. It had survived when many supposedly superior German tanks had not. As he watched Berlin burn from his commander's hatch, Collins understood what American industrial planners had known from the beginning. The best tank isn't necessarily the one with the thickest armour or biggest gun. The best tank is the one that wins the war. The story of the Sherman tank demonstrates a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Technical specifications alone do not determine battlefield success. Victory requires the right combination of design, production, training, tactics, and logistics. The Sherman succeeded not because it was the best tank in any single category, but because it was good enough in all categories and could be produced in numbers that overwhelmed the enemy. This lesson wasn't lost on military planners after the war. When designing the tanks that would face the Soviet Union during the Cold War, American engineers balanced technical performance against production realities. The M60 Patton and later the M1 Abrams incorporated this philosophy. Even today, military planners study the Sherman as a case study in effective weapon system development. The Sherman's legacy extends beyond military history. It represents the triumph of American industrial capacity and pragmatic engineering over German technical perfectionism. It demonstrates how innovation in tactics can overcome disadvantages in technology, and it shows how apparently inferior equipment, used properly and supplied in overwhelming quantities, can defeat supposedly superior weapons. For the thousands of American tank crews who fought and sometimes died in Shermans, the tank was neither the death trap of German propaganda nor the war-winning wonder weapon of American mythology. It was simply the tool they were given to do an incredibly dangerous job. Through skill, courage, and determination, they turned that tool into one of the most effective weapons of World War II. As the sun set on Berlin that April evening in 1945, Sergeant Collins ordered his crew to button up and move on to their next objective. The Sherman's engine rumbled to life, its tracks clanking against the cobblestone streets of the German capital. Somewhere ahead, the war continued. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The tank that Germans had once mocked would help deliver the final blow to the Nazi regime, proving that quantity, when combined with quality crews and sound tactics, would always overcome technical superiority alone. Sergeant Collins dismounted from his Sherman and stretched his aching back. 3 weeks had passed since they'd first entered German territory. The war was winding down, everyone knew it, yet men were still dying every day. Just yesterday, they'd lost 2 tanks from their company to a concealed 88mm gun. 8 good men gone in an instant. Yet here they stood, less than 30 miles from Berlin itself, the Nazi capital that had seemed so distant and impregnable when they'd landed in Normandy 11 months earlier. The Sherman beneath Collins' feet had traversed over 900 miles of European terrain since rolling off the landing craft at Omaha Beach. Its engine had been replaced twice. The transmission once, the radio 3 times. The right track assembly more times than Collins could remember. It had been hit by enemy fire 14 times, though never catastrophically. Small arms fire had peppered its hull so frequently that the crew had stopped repainting over the marks. The once pristine olive drab was now a patchwork of repairs, welds, and makeshift fixes. "Hey, Sarge," called Private Rodriguez from inside the tank. "The radio's buzzing again. Sounds like the brass wants us to halt here for the night." The advance toward Berlin had slowed dramatically over the past week. Rumors spread through the ranks that the High Command was deliberately holding back American forces, allowing the Soviets to take the Nazi capital. Politics, Collins thought bitterly. Men were still dying for politics. "Tell them," acknowledged, Collins replied, "and ask Lieutenant Morgan if we can get those replacement track links we've been promised for 3 days." As the sun set over the German countryside, Collins watched other Sherman tanks from his battalion establish defensive positions, 28 Shermans, arrayed in a semicircle facing east toward Berlin. 28 survivors, from the 50 that had begun the campaign in Normandy, yet for every Sherman lost, another had arrived to take its place. The factories back home never stopped producing them. Lieutenant Morgan approached on foot, clipboard in hand. A fresh-faced replacement officer who'd arrived just 2 weeks earlier, Morgan was still learning the realities of armored warfare. His pressed uniform and polished boots stood in stark contrast to Collins' oil-stained coveralls. "Sergeant Collins, how's Detroit Diesel holding up?" Morgan asked, referring to the tank by its nickname. Collins gestured at the battered Sherman. "She's tired, sir. Just like the rest of us. But she'll keep running, as long as we keep feeding her parts." Morgan nodded, making a note on his clipboard. The battalion received 10 replacement tanks yesterday. Brand new M4A3E8S with the 76mm guns. "Colonel wants to know if you'd prefer to transfer to one of those instead of continuing with this veteran." Collins ran his hand along the scarred turret of his tank. This machine had carried him across 4 countries. The crew had modified it extensively, added extra track links as makeshift armor on the front glacis plate, fabricated storage boxes for additional ammunition, even carved their names into the interior walls. It wasn't just a tank anymore, it was home. "No thanks, Lieutenant. We'll stick with the old girl." Morgan smiled. I thought you'd say that. Most of the veteran crews feel the same way. The new tanks will go to the replacement crews. He hesitated, then added, Supply convoy finally made it through. Your track links should arrive within the hour. After Morgan departed, Collins gathered his crew around a small fire they'd built behind the tank. Corporal Wilson, the gunner, Private First Class Henderson, the loader, Private Rodriguez, the radio operator and assistant driver, and Private Janowitz, the driver. 5 men who had lived in a steel box for the better part of a year. They'd started as strangers. Now they were closer than brothers. Mail came in with the supply trucks, Collins announced, distributing several envelopes. Henderson, 2 for you. Wilson, 1. Janowitz, 3. Your mother must be writing every day. Rodriguez, 1 from your sweetheart in San Antonio. The men fell silent as they read their letters, momentarily transported back to the world they'd left behind. Collins had no letters of his own. His wife had stopped writing 3 months ago. The War Department telegram had arrived 2 weeks later. Their home in Detroit had been hit during a factory fire. Sarah Collins had been working the night shift, helping build the very tanks her husband was fighting in. Hey, Sarge, Henderson said, breaking the silence. My dad sent a newspaper clipping. Says here they've built over 50,000 Shermans since 1942. Can you believe that? 50,000. Collins nodded. The number didn't surprise him. Back in 1942, during training, his commanding officer had explained the American philosophy of tank warfare. The Germans might build better tanks, but we'll build more of them. A lot more. How many Tigers you figure they built? Rodriguez asked. Not even 2,000, Wilson replied. He had been a tank enthusiast before the war, studying technical journals and following the development of armored warfare, and fewer than 5,000 Panthers. Altogether, not even 7,000 of their heavy tanks. We outproduced them 7-1. Janowitz snorted. Fat lot of good our numbers did Johnson and Peters yesterday. Their Shermans burned just like all the others. The mood darkened. Every man there had seen Sherman tanks hit by German 88s, watched them burst into flames with their crews still inside. The Germans had a saying, a German tank needs 4 hits to be destroyed. Tank needs 8 hits. An American tank needs just 1 hit. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it contained enough truth to hurt. We're still here, Collins said firmly. Johnson and Peters aren't. And that's a damn tragedy. But for every Sherman the Germans knock out, we've got 10 more coming. For every Tiger they build, they need special transportation just to get it to the front, because the damn thing is too heavy for most bridges and too wide for most tunnels. Their fancy engineering doesn't mean much when it's sitting on a rail car 200 miles from the battle. As darkness fell completely, Collins took the first watch. Sitting in the commander's hatch, he scanned the horizon through his binoculars. The German countryside was beautiful, even scarred by war, farmhouses with steep roofs, fields that would soon be planted again, once the fighting stopped. Church steeples in the distance, some still standing despite the artillery barrages that had swept through ahead of the Allied advance. Collins thought about the journey that had brought him here. The landing at Omaha Beach, where they'd nearly lost Detroit Diesel to the incoming tide before they could even engage the enemy. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy, where German infantry with Panzerfausts lurked behind every thick wall of vegetation. The breakout after Operation Cobra, when Sherman tanks had raced across France so quickly that they outran their fuel supplies. The desperate defense during the Battle of the Bulge, where snow-covered Shermans had held the line against the final German offensive. In each of these campaigns, the Sherman had adapted. When the 75mm gun proved inadequate against Panther frontal armor, they developed the 76mm. When the narrow tracks bogged down in mud, they developed wider versions. When crews complained about the tendency of ammunition to catch fire when the tank was hit, they developed wet stowage systems that stored rounds in water-jacketed containers that reduced the chance of fire. The Germans, meanwhile, kept building bigger, more complex tanks. The Tiger II, introduced in 1944, weighed nearly 70 tons, more than twice the weight of a Sherman. It had a gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges over 2 kilometers. Its frontal armor was nearly impenetrable to Sherman guns, but Germany built only 489 of them. Many broke down before ever reaching the front lines. Others ran out of fuel and were abandoned by their crews. Around midnight, Wilson relieved Collins on watch. "Get some sleep, Sarge. You look dead on your feet." Collins nodded gratefully and climbed down from the tank. He unrolled his bedding underneath Detroit Diesel, taking comfort in the solid steel above his head. Before closing his eyes, he pulled out a worn photograph. A Sherman tank assembly line at the Detroit Arsenal. Hundreds of tanks in various stages of completion, with workers, mostly women, swarming over them like ants. His wife Sarah was among them, though he could never pick her out in the small black and white image. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Collins woke to the sound of engines starting up throughout the battalion position. Another day of the advance. Another day closer to Berlin. Another day closer to the end of the war, God willing. "Battalions moving out in 20 minutes, Lieutenant Morgan announced as he made his rounds. "We're to advance to these coordinates and hold position." He handed Collins a map with the day's objective marked. Collins studied it briefly. "That's less than 15 miles from the city centre, sir." Morgan nodded. "Word is the Russians are pushing hard from the east. High Command wants us in position to link up with them, but not to enter Berlin proper unless ordered." The convoy of Shermans rolled out precisely at 0700 hours. Detroit Diesel took its usual position in the middle of the formation. Collins stood in the commander's hatch, scanning the terrain ahead for any sign of enemy activity. German resistance had become increasingly disorganized in recent days, but also more desperate. Volkssturm militia, old men and boys pressed into service in the final days of the Reich, fought with a fanaticism that regular German army units had long since abandoned. "Panther, at 2 o'clock, Wilson shouted suddenly from below. "Behind the farmhouse." Collins swung his binoculars to the right. There it was, the distinctive silhouette of a Panther tank, its long 75mm KWK 42 gun pointing directly at the American column. Even at this late stage of the war, the sight of a Panther sent a chill down Collins's spine. Collins ordered, "Gunner, target that Panther and fire when ready." Janowitz threw the Sherman into a sharp left turn just as the Panther fired. The German shell passed less than 2 feet over Detroit Diesel's turret, close, enough that Collins felt the heat of its passage. Wilson traversed the turret, bringing the Sherman's 76mm gun to bear. "On the way!" Wilson called as he fired. The Sherman rocked backward from the recoil. Through his binoculars, Collins watched the American shell strike the Panther on its right side, just below the turret ring, a successful penetration. Black smoke began pouring from the German tank, followed seconds later by flames licking around the hatches. "Good shot, Wilson," Collins said calmly, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "Driver, resume course." No German crew emerged from the burning Panther. Another 5 men who wouldn't be going home to their families. Collins felt no elation, only a grim satisfaction that it had been the enemy who died this time, not his own crew. By mid-afternoon, the battalion had reached its objective with minimal resistance, just 2 more brief skirmishes with German infantry armed with Panzerfausts. They established a defensive position on a low ridge overlooking a small German town. Through his binoculars, Collins could see the distant outline of Berlin's outskirts. As the crews performed maintenance on their tanks, a jeep pulled up to the battalion command post. A colonel from division headquarters climbed out, carrying a leather satchel. After a brief conference with the battalion commander, the colonel departed, and Lieutenant Morgan summoned the tank commanders. "Gentlemen," the battalion commander began, "I've just received new orders from division. Effective immediately, all American forces are to halt their advance toward Berlin. We will maintain current positions until further notice." A murmur ran through the assembled officers and NCOs. Morgan raised his hand. "Sir, may I ask why? We're less than 15 miles from the city." The commander nodded. "The decision has been made at the highest levels. Berlin is to be left to the Russians. Political considerations. He didn't sound happy about it. Our new mission is to prevent any German forces from escaping westward from the city. We're to form a blocking position and capture or destroy any enemy forces attempting to flee the Soviet advance. Collins and the other tank commanders returned to their vehicles to inform their crews. The news was met with mixed reactions. Some men were relieved entering Berlin would have meant vicious street fighting, where the advantages of tanks were minimized and the risk to crews maximized. Others were frustrated that after nearly a year of combat, they wouldn't be among the forces to capture Hitler's capital. So close, yet so far, Rodriguez commented as he cleaned the tank's radio. Better than getting killed on the last day of the war, Henderson replied pragmatically. My cousin was with the 1st Infantry Division, said fighting in Aachen was a nightmare, house to house, room to room, tanks are just big targets in cities. Collins listened to his crew discuss the news as he inventoried their ammunition. They had 17 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition left for the main gun, 24 high-explosive rounds, 6 white phosphorus smoke rounds, and about 2,000 rounds for the machine guns. Enough for one more serious engagement, maybe 2. Then they'd need resupply again. That night, the eastern horizon glowed red with fires burning in Berlin's outskirts. Soviet artillery pounded the German capital relentlessly. Through his binoculars, Collins could see the flashes of shells exploding, the tracers of anti-aircraft fire rising from the city, and the occasional larger explosion when an ammunition dump or fuel storage facility was hit. Hard to believe we're watching the end of Nazi Germany, Wilson said quietly, standing beside Collins on the turret of their Sherman. 4 years of fighting, and it comes down to this. Collins nodded. The Germans started this war thinking they were invincible. Their tanks were better than everyone else's. Their regiment, tactics were better, their soldiers were better, and for a while, they were right. What changed? Collins gestured toward Detroit diesel beneath their feet. This changed, not just this tank, but what it represents. American industry, Soviet numbers, British determination. The Germans built tanks that could win battles. We built tanks that could win the war. The next morning, the battalion received orders to relocate 5 miles south to block a secondary road leading from Berlin. Intelligence indicated that elements of the SS Panzer divisions defending the city might attempt to break out in that direction rather than surrender to the Soviets. As Detroit diesel rumbled into its new position, Collins noticed something he hadn't seen before, a freshly painted slogan on the side of another Sherman in their company. In white letters, someone had painted Detroit vs. Berlin with a crude scoreboard beneath it showing 50,000, 1,000, 500, with the clear implication of comparing Sherman production to Tiger production. Collins smiled grimly. The numbers weren't precisely accurate, but the sentiment was right. American industrial might had overwhelmed German technical superiority. The war of production had been won long before the war of tactics. For 3 days, Collins and his crew maintained their blocking position. They watched the red glow over Berlin grow more intense as the Soviet advance pressed deeper into the city. Occasionally, they heard the distant rumble of tanks engaging Soviet T-34 seconds and IS-2 seconds, battling the last of the German Panthers and Tigers in the streets of the capital. On the morning of May 1, 1945, word reached them that Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The news spread quickly through the American lines. Men cheered, shook hands, slapped each other on the back. The monster responsible for so much death and destruction was finally gone. But the war wasn't quite over. That afternoon, Collins' battalion received reports of German vehicles approaching their position from the direction of Berlin. The Americans readied their weapons. Detroit diesel's engine rumbled to life as Janowitz prepared for possible movement. Multiple vehicle signatures, Rodriguez reported from the radio. Battalion says at least 20 tanks and armoured personnel carriers heading our way. Collins ordered his crew to battle stations. Wilson traversed the turret, pointing the 76mm gun down the road from Berlin. Henderson loaded an armour-piercing round into the breech. Rodriguez manned the bow machine gun, Janowitz positioned the tank for a clear field of fire while maintaining cover behind a low stone wall. Through his binoculars, Collins spotted the lead vehicles, German half-tracks filled with soldiers, followed by several Panther tanks. The German column moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if uncertain of their reception. "Hold fire," Collins ordered. "Something's not right." As the German vehicles drew closer, Collins saw white flags flying from their radio antennas and makeshift white sheets draped over their turrets. The lead half-track stopped about 500 meters from the American position. A German officer climbed out, clearly visible in his field grey uniform, and walked forward alone with his hands raised. Lieutenant Morgan and the battalion commander drove out in a jeep to meet the German. After a brief conversation, they escorted him back to the American lines. Within the hour, the entire German column had surrendered 19 half-tracks carrying infantry from the Großdeutschland Division and 7 Panther tanks from the 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf. Nearly 300 German Kopfvolls. Soldiers laid down their arms without firing a shot. "They say the Russians are executing SS men on sight," Morgan explained to Collins later. "These boys decided they'd rather surrender to Americans. Can't say I blame them. Seems the Russians have some scores to settle." In the days that followed, more German units sought out American positions to surrender. By May 8th, when Germany formally capitulated, Collins' battalion had accepted the surrender of over 2,000 German troops and 39 armoured vehicles, including 11 Panther tanks, 3 Tiger Is, and even one of the rare Tiger IIs. Collins examined the captured German tanks with professional curiosity. The Panther was indeed an impressive machine, sloped armour, an excellent high-velocity gun, good optics. The Tiger II was even more formidable, a 70-ton behemoth with armour so thick that standard Sherman shells would barely scratch it. But examining them up close, Collins also saw their weaknesses. The Panther's final drive, the mechanism that transferred power from the transmission to the tracks, was fragile and prone to failure. The Tiger's engines and transmissions were overcomplicated and maintenance-intensive. Both tanks consumed enormous quantities of fuel, which Germany had been critically short of in the war's final years. By contrast, Detroit Diesel remained operational with only basic maintenance. Its engine could run on low-quality fuel if necessary. Parts could be swapped from other Shermans when needed. It wasn't the best tank of the war by any technical measure, but it was good enough, and there were always more of them. 2 weeks after Germany's surrender, Collins received orders that his crew would be rotating back to the United States. The war in Europe was over, but the conflict with Japan continued in the Pacific. Detroit Diesel would remain in Germany, likely to be used by occupation forces or transferred to Allied armies rebuilding after the war. On their final day with the tank, Collins gathered his crew for a photograph beside their battered Sherman. A passing war correspondent obliged them by taking the picture. 5 weary men standing proudly beside the machine that had carried them through 11 months of combat. "What happens to her now?" Henderson asked, patting the tank's hull. Collins shrugged. "She'll probably go to the French or maybe the Free Polish forces, or she might get shipped to the Pacific if the war there drags on." "Seems wrong somehow," Rodriguez said. "After all we've been through together." Collins understood the sentiment. The tank had been their home, their protector, their weapon. It had kept them alive when so many others had died. It wasn't just a machine to them. Before leaving, Collins took out his pocket knife and carefully etched 5 names into the interior wall of the commander's position, where they would remain regardless of who operated the tank next. Collins, Wilson, Henderson, Rodriguez, Janowitz, Berlin, 1945. As they walked away from Detroit Diesel for the last time, Collins glanced back at the Sherman. It wasn't the mightiest tank ever built. It wasn't the most heavily armoured or the most powerfully armed. German tankers had mocked it, called it a death trap and a Ronson lighter. Yet there it stood in the heart of Germany, its olive drab paint scratched and scarred but unbowed, while the vaunted Tigers and Panthers lay abandoned across Europe, their technical superiority rendered meaningless by American industrial might and the courage of the men who fought in these supposedly inferior machines. Years later, long after the war, Military historians would debate the merits of the Sherman tank. Some would criticize American leadership for not developing a heavier tank sooner. Others would praise the pragmatic decision to mass-produce a reliable, versatile design, rather than chase technical perfection at the expense of numbers. The debate would never be fully resolved, but for Michael Collins and the thousands of other American tankers who fought across Europe in Shermans, the question had been answered definitively on the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Germany. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War I, but it was the tank that won World War II. In a war museum in Bastogne, Belgium, visitors today can see a preserved M4 Sherman next to a Tiger tank. The Sherman looks almost diminutive beside the massive German machine. Yet a small plaque beside the display tells the true story. The Tiger could destroy a Sherman from 2,000 meters. But for each Tiger, America built 33 Shermans. Germany built approximately 1,347 Tigers of all types during the entire war. The United States built 49,324 Shermans. Quantity, as Stalin reportedly said, had a quality all its own. The humble Sherman, mocked by German tankers for its inadequacies, had prevailed through the simple mathematics of industrial production. The tank that was never meant to be the best became, in its own way, unbeatable. In the decades that followed, American military planners would never forget the lesson of the Sherman. Technical sophistication must always be balanced against producibility. The perfect tank that cannot be built in sufficient numbers is ultimately less valuable than the adequate tank that can be produced by the thousands. It's a lesson that continues to influence military procurement to this day. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.